Welcome to another episode of Couch Catechism. I'm your host, Michael Abid from Veracious Media. Before we get started, I need you to like and subscribe to this channel just to help us with our work, just so we can get the message and evangelize to as many people to whom this information might be beneficial. Tonight is a special episode. I'm going to be going solo, and what I'm going to be speaking about is a topic that it's not that it's close to home, but it's something that I get asked a lot by people who are wanting to come over to the faith. They're thinking about the truth of Catholicism, but they're hindered by the fact that they make a connection between the church, who is beautiful, who is holy, who is real, who sanctifies her members, but then at the same time, the religious clerics and our priests who have fallen victim or who have been accused, and the bad ones as well, who have been the perpetrators of sex abuse, especially amongst children. Now, when I was wanting to do a bit of investigation and research into this topic, when I was coming over to the faith many years ago, and it's just been a bit resurfaced now, what I did was I had a look at a very important document that was released by the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops. And the report is called the John Jay Report. And I advise everybody to have a read of it. It's a very, very interesting document. And what happened was that in 2002, or after 2002, there was a lady by the name of Kathleen McKesney, and she was the director of the Office for Child and Youth Protection. And what she did was she approached the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. She approached its president to discuss the feasibility of the college conducting studies to be able to investigate the nature and scope of sexual abuse of minors by Catholic priests and deacons. They wanted to lay it out all on the table. They wanted to find out why it was so prevalent within society, and especially within the church, because they wanted to show that they wanted to actually do something about it. And other than the Royal Commission, which was conducted around 2014 to 2016 in Australia, this report that was done in 2002 was the most extensive and professional report that was done and survey that was done in the world. And there was no other institution into which child sex abuse cases had been prevalent in America at the time that had done what the church had done. And this was actually mandated by the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops. Now, what we're going to be looking at is I'm going to be slowly just going through this, and I'm just going to be reading bits and pieces of from the report that I find interesting. And I'm going to just walk you through it, read a little bit of it, and give you just a bit of my insights. We're hoping to go for about half an hour, so just bear with us. I think that you're going to find a lot of the information that we're going to be speaking about very relevant. Now, one thing that we noticed is when I was reading this was that from the extensive surveys that were done, they found that between the years 1950 and 2002, they found that this was where the child sex abuse cases were being reported. And this is kind of like the era or the time period in which it happened. And from the report that was done by the college, which was a very prestigious college, and the department itself has got very, very high credibility. You've got to read into the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. What they found was that this incident or this culture of child sex abuse, it wasn't just prevalent within the Catholic Church, it was prevalent everywhere. And if you have a look at the time period in which it happened between 1950 to 2002, around the year 1950 and onwards, it came off the back and at the start of the sexual revolution, which happened around the 60s. And so as I was reading the report, I also decided to do a bit of investigation into the sexual revolution itself to see whether there was some sort of a connection and to see whether the actual effects of the sexual revolution not only had an impact upon society, but it led its way into the church as well. And you're going to find some of the information a little bit interesting. Now, the college was selected because it is a secular institution, okay? So it's not affiliated with the church, okay? And it also has a national reputation in the fields of criminal justice, criminology, and forensic psychology. Now, what you're going to notice is that within the report, and this was commented on by an article, is that features and characteristics of the church, such as an exclusively male priesthood and the commitment to celibate chastity, were invariant during the increase, peak, and decrease in abuse incidents, and thus are not a cause of the crisis. So one myth that I want to dispel And one myth that the data points out is that a lot of people think that the reason why priests, especially married priests, they sexually abuse children is because the celibate priesthood is suppressive of one's natural inclinations and sexual desires. And because as a religious institution, it encourages or it forces people to adopt a celibate priesthood or to maintain a celibate life, automatically you're going to start to get like sexual deviations. But the reports actually noticed that the exclusively male priesthood and the commitment to celibate chastity, it didn't have an effect at all when it came to the data, because it showed that there was an increase which happened roughly around the 50s to the 60s, around the 60s. It peaked around the 70s, and then it started to decrease again. Okay, so they found that the exclusively male priesthood, as well as the celibacy, they said the word invariant, but I'm going to translate that word invariant. It means that it meant nothing. Okay, now 2 surveys were done. And this is another interesting fact that I found, was that the total number of priests with allegations of abuse in the survey was 4,392. Now, why is that an important number? Was because within the period between 1950 to 2002, out of the 4,392 allegations, allegations that were made of abuse, there were 109,694 active priests. So if we use this number, okay, we find that 4% of all priests that were active between 1950 to 2002 had allegations of sexual abuse. 4%. Now, what's interesting about that is that the way that the media and the way that people in general look at the Catholic Church today, especially when I'm in the classroom or when I'm speaking to people, it's almost as though automatically as soon as they hear the word Catholic priest within our secular society, they make an association between a priest and a pedophile, or a priest and somebody who commits sex abuse. But if we look at the data from the John Jay report, we find that 4% of all priests, 4% of all priests that had allegations of abuse against them, 4 priests actually had allegations of abuse out of the 109,694 cases. And you're going to find that actually even fewer than 4 priests had allegations, because of the fact that when an incidence of child sex abuse was reported, multiple sexual abuses could have been reported by the same priest. So even though there were 4,392 allegations of abuse, it doesn't mean that there were 4,392 priests. Now, just so that you don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to defend priests, and I'm not trying to defend the fact that we've got a disproportionately small number within the John Jay report of sex abusing priests compared to those people who actually committed abuse. All right, all I'm trying to say is that I'm trying to dispel a myth, okay, that the Catholic Church, especially within America, within this time period, was disproportionately, the incidence of sex abuse was disproportionately Catholic amongst all the various sectors, okay? And I'm going to even speak about the New South Wales Ombudsman report that came out a couple of years ago, around 2015 or 2016, that I actually went to go see the report into child sex abuse outcomes and allegations into institutional sex abuse. And you'll find that even within the reports by the New South Wales Ombudsman, religious institutions and the Catholic Church comprised about 10% at the time from the evidence that came out. And it was actually over 50% of allegations of sex abuse actually came from out-of-home foster care. Okay, 25% came from schools, from teachers, and roughly 10% came from religious institutions, of which the Catholic Church was just one of the religious institutions. So if people are going to be making accusations against the church to say that all Catholic priests are pedophiles, or the majority of Catholic priests have been accused within history of sex abuse allegations, that's a grave offense against justice and against truth, because that's actually not the case. And you'll also tend to find that when people make that kind of an association, you never ever hear people saying, and I'm a teacher myself, You'll never ever hear people say when you ask them, oh, what profession are you? I'm a teacher. Oh, ooh, be careful. Like, or are you sending your kids to school? Oh, don't send them to school because you know what teachers are like. You know, they're out of the reports. You know, 25% of teachers were convicted or allegations of sexual abuse came from teachers. Yet 10% came from priests. We don't go and make that association between teachers and child sex offenders. Yeah, or we don't even know, which is the biggest crisis at the moment within Australia, is within the out-of-home foster care service, because over 50% of abuses have come from the out of foster care system. All right, so that's something that's very important for you to keep on the back of your mind when we're looking and we're trying to dispel myths and when we're looking at the truth of the facts here. Okay, now. Here it says that the distribution of reported cases by the year of abuse is alleged to occur or to have begun shows a peak in the year 1970. However, considering the duration of some repeated abusive acts, more abuse occurred in the 70s than in any other decade that peaked in about 1980. Now, the reason why I mentioned that is because the report shows that there was an anomaly that happened around the 70s and the 80s. So before the 1950s, maybe it's the case that there wasn't much evidence that came out. There wasn't maybe a culture of reporting. But from the evidence that we have, we see that a lot of reports came out about abuses that happened within the 70s and the 80s. But for some reason, it went up, peaked around the 70s, and then it came down. Now, what I'm not saying and what the report doesn't suggest is that allegations of abuse came out in that time. No, most of the abuse allegations came out around the year around the late 90s, around the year 2000 as well, and just after 2000. But these people that were victims of child sex abuse allegations, they said that the abuses happened at in that time period. So we're seeing that a lot of incidences of child sex abuse or incidences of sex abuse happened around the 1970s. Okay, and this comes right off the bank of the sexual revolution with all its problems and so on and so forth. So what the John Jay report is noticing, that this was actually cultural, okay? Even though that the church and the priests were perpetrators, and there were members within the priests that were perpetrators. This was a cultural phenomenon, okay? This did not just occur within the Catholic Church. This was happening everywhere, okay? Now, going into detail as well, over 79% of priests were between the ages of 25 to 29 years of age when they were ordained. Now, why do I think that's important as well? Was because of the fact that a lot of people, they make the association as well that maybe they were priests, they came into the priesthood, they spent years in ministry, they're living in a celibate, repressive lifestyle, and so then they start to act out on their sexual urges and they start to become old pedophile priests, for example. But we find that these people were ordained between the ages of 25 to 29, but they started to abuse, or the largest group, over 40% of all the allegations of abuse occurred by priests. And we're speaking about priests specifically within the church between the ages of 30 to 39. Okay, so between the ages of 30 to 39. So that's considered relatively young. Now, why is that information important in my opinion? And I'm just thinking out loud here is because I'm thinking to myself, okay, these people have just come off the bank of the sexual revolution. Sigmund Freud, for example, was a very, very influential psychologist or psychoanalyst. And what he reported was that any mental illness or any deviation in sexual behavior is because somebody is trying to suppress their own natural sexual inclinations. Okay, and he became very famous. And one of his maxims that he used to live by, or that he was teaching in books that became very controversial, was the fact that you will kind of like the ultimate end and goal of one's life is to pretty much just live out their sexual desires. Okay, they need to do whatever kind of makes them feel good. It's kind of like a utilitarian kind of way of thinking, in which you should only follow, or you should only seek ends for which will give you and derive the most pleasure. Okay, and so you see the introduction of the pill that came about in the 50s and the 60s. You had Margaret Sanger that released a book as well, around I think the 20s or the 30s before that. But you had this entire culture, post-war, post baby boomer generation. People were just starting to see through these psychoanalysts and a couple of these leaders, they were starting to see traditional values such as marriage, such as sex before marriage being wrong, such as the monogamy of sexual relations being between a man and a woman. They saw them as being repressive, and anything that they associated with tradition, they associated it with being repressive. And so they wanted to kind of be like liberated from that. But the only problem though was that sexual promiscuity was a little bit hard before the 50s, because sexual promiscuity without the use of contraception would lead to pregnancies. Okay. And so women knew that. And so you tended to find that women were not able to kind of be sexually liberated because they still had the risks of becoming impregnated if they wanted to fulfill their sexual, their repressed sexual desires. Okay, so what happened was that in the 50s, at the advent of the pill, okay, women started to see themselves as sexually liberated. They could now have the freedom to be able to express their sexual desires without the consequence of having children. And so that led to like increases in sexual promiscuity. You had Hugh Hefner, who ended up releasing Playboy in the 50s. You ended up with Playboy magazine. You ended up with the introduction of of pornographic movies and scenes and theater and so on and so forth. This was massive. So you got to imagine people who are young, 18 to 20, that are going into the priesthood with the right intentions, okay, wanting to become priests. They're getting a lot of this culture, this revolution was just being smashed, and it smashed in through the seminaries, into the culture, into the minds of these people. So they came into the seminary at a very, very, very dangerous and hostile time. And so they probably made associations between their celibate priesthood, and they probably felt repressed at the time. So then that's the reason why you probably start to see them between the ages of 30 to 39 acting out. Okay. Like I said, I'm not trying to justify their behavior. I'm just trying to give you an understanding of what was happening at that time, what the sentiment was, what the culture was at that time, in order to be able to kind of like shed light on why this happened, and to look at the age brackets and to see why the anomalies were taking place between the 70s and the 80s. Okay, because it tended to die down after that, and it wasn't because of treatment. Okay, which is what we're going to be seeing later on. Now, nearly 23% were between the ages of 40 to 49, and about 17% were over 50. Okay, because obviously the sexual urges are coming down over the ages of 50, and maybe the culture and the psychology that the sexual revolution was banking on was what do you call it? Didn't have an effect on them. The majority of priests were alleged to have abused one victim, okay? And nearly 27 were alleged to have abused 2 or 3 victims, okay? Nearly 14% were alleged to have abused 4 to 9 victims, and 3 to 4% were alleged to have abused more than 10. Now, the 149 priests, 3.5% who had more than 10 allegations of abuse, were allegedly responsible for abusing 2,960 victims, accounting for 20% of allegations. Therefore, a very small percentage of accused priests are responsible for a substantial percentage of the allegations. So like I said before, you had around 4,300 allegations of sexual abuse, and you had 109,000 priests that were in active ministry. But from what we're seeing, 2,960 of those abuses or of those victims were committed by only 149 priests. So you're seeing here that although 4% of all allegations of sexual abuse were done, okay, against these priests, okay, we say 4%. That doesn't mean that it's 4% of priests, because we're seeing that there are 149 priests within this given set of data that account for over 20%, 26% of all the abuses. Okay, now these are like predators, predator perpetrators, but I found that to be a very interesting statistic nonetheless. Now, this is the sad part though. another myth that people make the claim to say about the church is that a lot of and this is neither here nor there, but it's just kind of dispelling one of the myths anyway, is that the Catholic priests are pedophiles. Now, in order for a person to be classified a pedophile, it means they have a disordered sexual fantasy or desire that's permanent and lasting for someone that is of a prepubescent age. Okay, and so that's probably roughly between the ages of just under the ages of 14, okay? But what we're finding here is that the largest group of alleged victims, over half, 50%, were between the ages of 11 to 14, okay? 27.3% were between the ages of 15 to 17, 16% were between the ages of 8 to 10, and nearly 6% were under the age of 7. So 81% of the victims were male and 19% were female. Now, although the John Jay report says that the abuses were committed by people that didn't show homosexual tendencies, I would like to just look at the data and just to see why is it that 81% of victims are male and 19% are female. Okay, that's a question that I would probably ask, because the psychoanalysis that's done by the report, and I want to be as honest as possible, says that the report says that the allegations, or says that the homosexual tendencies was not a factor, or in the report of child sex abuse cases. Okay, so it wasn't a factor. Another thing, the majority of priests within the allegations of abuse from 1950 to 2002 were ordained between 1950s and the 1970s. Okay, so the majority. Why is that important? Because it happened right within the heart of the sexual revolution. Okay, surveys indicated that some priests with allegations of sexual abuse also showed a variety of other behavioral problems, the most common of which were personality problems. Okay, so just looking here also, I'm seeing other interesting facts as well. There are records of 1,400 priests and deacons, nearly 1 in 3 of those against whom allegations of sexual abuse of a youth under 18 were made, showed a history of substance abuse, questions about his fitness for ministry, and behavioral problems. Alcohol abuse was reported much more frequently than drug abuse, implicated in 96% of the 753 priests with substance abuse information on their records. Okay, now why do I think that's important? Because the John Jay report specifically highlighted that fitness for ministry is kind of like a category by which the church uses to be able to see whether a person who's a candidate for the priesthood is fit for the ministry of the priesthood. But you notice that a lot of candidates for the priesthood, or a proportion of those who committed sexual abuse, were themselves addicted to some form of substance abuse, okay, including drugs, which wasn't that much, but what we see here is predominantly alcohol. And what you tend to find also in the report, when you read it, is that when it comes to alcohol abuse itself, you see that the perpetrators of sexual abuse used alcohol, not it was kind of disproportionate amongst their victims. Some of them, only a small percent, maybe 10 to 15% used it, of the incidents reported had the victims drinking alcohol to an excess in order to be able to be abused. But you tend to find that a high proportion of people who abused were intoxicated or used substance in order to kind of suppress their guilt and shame, in order to allow them to be able to commit these offenses. Again, the gender of the alleged victim, male only, 64%. 64%. 11 to 14-year-old males make up 50 to 9% of victims of sexual abuse. Okay? Now, when it comes to fitness for ministry as well, according to psychological reports, I don't know whether they will lapse, but I think that one of the requirements for a person to be fit for the ministry of a priesthood, and I don't know whether these people lied about it or not, is I think that sexual same-sex attraction or same-sex tendencies is an impediment to the priesthood, or provides an impediment to the priesthood. And the reason why is because the priesthood in itself, within its nature, within the sacramentality of the priesthood, is that the priest is offering up his desire for procreation and family in order for a higher calling, to be a spiritual father to his children within his parish or within his diocese. So for a person who has same-sex attraction, that sacrifice of wanting a wife and wanting to procreate and have his own children might not be there. And that therefore provides an impediment, and that also is a factor that would make one not fit for ministry. Now, I think, and one of you guys would probably have to do a little bit more research yourself and maybe come back at me with answers, is that same-sex attraction during this time period, within this anomaly, within the 60s and the 70s, might have been a little bit relaxed, and they were allowing people to go into seminary regardless of whether they had same-sex attraction, or these people who had same-sex attraction were hiding or not disclosing the fact that they had same-sex attraction because they knew that it might pose an impediment to their candidacy to becoming priests. And also, like, we have to look at the culture at the time, because homosexuality was kind of shunned within traditional circles around the 50s and the 60s. A lot of people who probably had same-sex attraction saw ministry of the church as an outlet, okay, to be able to go into the ministry, okay, because obviously they had no desire to want to have families, and probably they to avoid questions or to avoid having problems or to be seen as kind of like the odd one out within their own families, they probably decided that it's probably safer or probably better for them, okay, to be able to go into something like a ministry, like a male-only priesthood, so that they wouldn't be asked. But that's just me thinking off the top of my head. Feel free to comment on your thoughts. I'm yet to find evidence on that, but I'll definitely look into that. Now, unlike in the general population, more males than females were allegedly abused, and there was a significant difference between genders, with 4 out of 5 alleged victims being male. Okay, again, that backs up that information as well. And the last thing that I just want to show is that there was action that was actually taken for priests who were abused, even though there was a lot of cover up. But from the report, it says that the action taken for priests that was subject to substantiated allegations, not uncredible allegations, but substantiated. Maybe they had gone to the police or they had gone to the church or so on and so forth, is that you found that 11%, which is unfortunate, when the allegations were made, 11% of those priests were already dead, okay, at the time that the allegations were made, so they couldn't be incriminated or they couldn't be prosecuted. 29.1% of priests were retired at the time of the allegation. Only 6% got laicized. And from my studies, I found that the reason why only 6% were laicized or stripped of their priesthood was because I think the canonical procedures at the time were a bit like complicated. And so that was the reason why it was a lot harder probably for bishops to be able to try to find ways to laicize priests. But you know what? That's no excuse. That number should definitely be a lot higher than that. And 53% of priests were sent for treatment, and 45% of priests were suspended. Okay, and from my own research, Pope Benedict XVI was responsible for the laicization of over 800 priests. Don't get me wrong on this number. It's either 400 or 800 priests. That's still a massive number during his time that he was Pope. So another myth that the church had done nothing about it, or that the Pope Benedict had done nothing about it. I think he laicized more priests than any of his predecessors for incidences of child sex abuse. Okay, he had less of a toleration for it than his predecessors did. Okay, and predecessors meaning that the Pope, probably Saint Pope John Paul II before him, who was probably the first, or maybe Pope Pius XII as well, or Pope John Paul I, and then Pope Pius VI before him, who found out about that. Now, although it is clear, now this is one thing that the John Jay report says that's very, very important, and I want to end on this. They said that although it is clear that there is no cure for sex offenders, certain treatment regimes appear to be successful at reducing rates of recidivism for certain types of offenders. So the thing that we have to understand as well, and I didn't read this in the John Jay report, but I did read this somewhere else, was that a lot of people accuse the church and accuse bishops of shuffling priests. Now, I do understand that there were bishops that acted with bad intentions, and what they did was that they just got priests and they shuffled them into other dioceses, and then they continued to abuse there. But from what I've read in another paper, the reason why priests were transferred was because, according to the psychological analysis and the reports at the time, they were acting upon their advice, because they said that as part of the treatment for child sex abuses, part of the treatment in order to get them treated was to have them transferred to another diocese or to another new location where they would be in a new environment, where people wouldn't know them as an offender, and where they would be able to start from scratch. They'd be able to get treatment, and that was part of the rehabilitation process. Okay, but the bishops, okay, admitted that from what we now know, and the psychologists, from what they now know, is that because it is incurable, the research has changed, and they know that that was ineffective. Okay, so that was just pretty much a short summary of the John Jay report, guys. I really would like you, if I've sparked some interest for you to want to just learn a little bit more. I really think that it's important for you and for us and for the church to be able to look at this data, to look at the statistics, to be able to look at the research, to dispel some of these myths, okay? In order to be able to not only, it's not so much just to defend our priests and to defend the church, but it's in an effort and to be able to find the truth, yeah? Because if people are going to just go and say to you out of nowhere, oh, you know what, like all priests are pedophiles, for example, or all priests are sex abusers, you know, you can say, well, where do you get that evidence from? You know, are you just listening to fake news? Like, is that where you're getting your evidence from? Because from the John Jay report, it looks as though only 4% of priests, and it's not even of priests, it's allegations of sexual abuse that happened between the 50s to the year 2002. Maybe the data has changed there, but it's roughly, and they used a very conservative figure, between 4, maybe 5, maybe even 6% of all priests, okay, are have been accused of sexual abuse, okay? So that means that 6 priests out of 100. So you're going to label 94 priests as child sex abusers when only 4 of them have been actually accused. And don't forget that also the data shows that that one priest could have been responsible for 25% of the abuses. So it's actually less than that, okay? So we need to understand this kind of information, why, in order to defend our priests, especially, but not, sorry, to defend the perpetrators, but to defend our good priests who have given up their lives for this ministry, yeah, who have decided to sacrifice everything, wanting to have families, wanting to pursue a career, the loneliness that they get from being in their ministry, in order so that they can go out and hear confessions, baptize, say mass, go out and help people, give communion to people and solace to people that are in aged care facilities and in nursing homes. This is their ministry, and this is what they do. And I'm very passionate about this because I know a lot of good priests, and I feel like they need to be defended. Because rather than slandering them, especially from people within our secular media, we need to be able to look at the information to be able to defend them. To be able to say, no, we know good priests, and the majority of them, the overwhelming majority of them are good priests who are devoted to their ministry and devoted to serving other people, to loving people out of charity for love of God. They want to bring people to Christ, and they want to love the community, and they want to do what they can. They want to be people of service. Okay, and these are priests that are within our schools, that are priests that are going to be marrying and baptizing your children, and so on and so forth. So we need to clear the confusion, and we need to finally be people of truth who are willing to come to terms with the facts. Okay, so please look into the John Jay report, defend your priest, defend the church. That was another episode of Couch Catechism. I hope you liked this episode. If you want to see more, if you've got any ideas for any topics, please leave them in the comment section below, and I'll try my best to address them maybe in another episode. That was another week. I'm Michael Obeid. Stay strong, keep the faith, and we'll see you again. And there are some probably people that are listening that are probably wounded at the moment.
Everything we've spoken about tonight,
Yep.
none of that happens outside of prayer time.
We'll be able to start a conversation about, the hope that exists.
The fact that people have just not been catechized.
At its most fundamental level, the way to love somebody authentically and most chastely is to love them most deeply.
We believe that God desires every single person to be saved. It doesn't matter who it is.
But Christ is the true priest. He's the head. The church is his mystical body.